2 Minuten noch.
Ja, schon noch mal.
Ja,
Also, die Leute sind.
aber es sind Leute, die in Livestream machen. Das ist das, was uns passiert.
Ach so, okay.
Das ist,
Okay. Ich kann ein bisschen die Nase bohren, dann haben Sie, haben Sie was zum Lachen.
ja, das ist echt
Ja. Ja.
das ist cool.
Aber wo ist die Antifa, wenn Sie schon einladen?
Zumindest habe ich einen Security-Mann von unserer Gemeinde, der beim Eingang steht.
Ich habe es gesehen. Ja,
Hoffentlich reicht das.
sehr gut. Aber der muss mit Rosenkranz bewaffnet sein.
Ja,
Das ist, sonst zählt das nicht. Ja, mal schauen. Vielleicht sitzt die ja noch drin. Was machen wir dann?
Ich werde auf Englisch dann sprechen, du entscheidest, ob du auf Deutsch oder
Na,
Englisch.
ich begrüße schon auf Deutsch. Was sagt die Wissenschaft? Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen hier im Kunst im Brückel. Mein Name ist Jan Dedorowski, ich bin Präsident der Plattform Christdemokratie und Mitglied der Evangelischen Allianz in Wien. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie unserer Einladung gefolgt sind zu einem wirklich spannenden Vortrag, zu einem extrem wichtigen, aber auch kontroversiellen Thema. Und deswegen ist es wichtig, dass wir uns damit auseinandersetzen und auch die richtigen Worte dafür finden. Ich möchte mich ganz besonders bei einigen Organisationen bedanken, die diese Veranstaltung möglich gemacht haben. Sie sehen auch die Logos hinter mir. Das ist Alliance Defending Freedom, das ist die Burg Klamm und das ist auch Bruderhof. Vom Bruderhof möchte ich auch ganz herzlich begrüßen. Ich sehe Sie jetzt nicht. Da hinten Kim und Ulrike Kromer. Danke sehr, dass ihr da seid und diese Veranstaltung unterstützt. Ebenfalls begrüßen möchte ich den Leiter der Evangelischen Allianz Wien, Günther Körber. Wo bist du? Wahrscheinlich brav draußen und beim Arbeiten, wunderbar. Und auch meine liebe Freundin und Kollegin, die Sua Demek, Vizepräsidentin der Plattform Christdemokratie. Danke auch, dass du da bist. Und vor allem gilt mein Dank Johannes Unoson, der maßgeblich diese Veranstaltung geplant hat, vorbereitet hat, im Hintergrund gearbeitet hat, auch daran gearbeitet hat, dass es medial aufgegriffen wird, der die Initiative gezeigt hat und die Vision gehabt hat und es wirklich auch durchgeführt hat, dass Professor Regnerus nach Wien kommt. Und ich darf das Mikro an dich übergeben.
Danke, Jan. So, I will continue in English. Today I will give you a short introduction why this topic, gender identity, is relevant for Austria, why it's relevant for the Evangelical Alliance and our churches, and why it's relevant for you. And then we will have the privilege to listen to Professor Mark Regnerus on the subject, the unsettling and unsettled science of gender identity. And as he speaks, you can also, if you have internet, enter your questions in pigeonhole.at with the password gender, and you can vote for other questions what you think should be answered today by Mark Regnerus. And afterwards, at 8:15, we can do some networking and order something to drink in the bar. So this is the program for tonight. About pigeonhole.at, we also have people in the live stream watching us. They can also, of course, ask questions. It's the same situation if you're online or if you're here. You can answer your questions and you can also vote, and we will ask Mark Regnerus those questions which gets the most votes. So you decide which questions will be answered. This is Swedish, you know, and I first got aware of this topic when I read the Swedish newspaper Svenska Dagbladet in 2019, because Professor Gillberg at the Gothenburg University, he expressed his deep concern that hundreds of children, as he says, get treated with the diagnosis dysphoria, get treated with hormones and get a genital mutilation, for example, get their breast removed. And this without any, as he writes, without any scientific foundation or evidence-based evidence that shows that this is the right path. So I got alarmed myself and said, what's this? What is happening here? And I also tried to see what's happening in other countries. And I read the Daily Mail in 2019. And UK and also Sweden are two of the countries in Europe where this trend started early. Already 2019, as you can see here, there were hundreds of transgendered youth who doubted that their surgeries to change their sex was the right thing to do, and they wanted to transition back again. And also in Germany, 2019, children psychiatrist Alexander Korte wrote that there is an enormous increase of young people who want to change their sex. And the numbers had increased 5 times from 2013 to 2019. And just this year, I got the numbers also from Austria, from Gesundheit Österreich GmbH, and they had the numbers now until 2020. And in Austria, during the last 2019-2020, there have been about 400 patients treated for dysphoria in the Austrian hospitals. And as you can see, about 2/3 of those 400 patients are below 30. And also when it comes to women who don't want to be women anymore, Austria is also following the international trend. Here you can see in the diagram that 2010, there were 10 women or girls who wanted to change their sex and had their breast removed, mastectomy it's called. And 2019, it was even 140. So this is in Austria, official statistics. And so there is an increase within 9 years of 1,400%. And then last year, because 2020, because of the pandemic, I guess many surgeries were postponed, so there is a little bit less, but still over 100 breast amputation surgeries because somebody felt they are in the wrong body. So I don't know about you, but as I read about these problems in Sweden and also got informed how it is in UK and Germany and Austria, I felt I have the obligation to get informed and also to help and to see how we can help together, that these girls know that they don't need to do that. They are okay as they are. They don't need to change their sex to be okay. And actually, you cannot really change your sex. And I don't know if you know Hans Christian Andersen, he's Danish. He wrote the story about the emperor's new clothes. And as you maybe remember, everyone who cannot see how beautiful the clothes are of the emperor, they are not fit for their job. And I don't know what profession you are in, if you're in the IT or medical business or wherever you are, but it doesn't matter what profession you are in, this topic gets relevant everywhere. And I hope that we, after this lecture today, have the courage at least to whisper or maybe even to say it out loud, the emperor is naked. But you have to have the courage, because maybe somebody will tell you that you're unfit for your job. I'm very happy to now introduce to you Dr. Mark Regnerus. Mark Regnerus is a professor of sociology at the University of Texas at Austin, and also senior fellow at the Austrian Institute for the Study of, Austin Institute, not Austrian, Austin Institute of the Study of Family and Culture. And he have done a lot of research on sexuality and relationship behavior, and he also criticizes substandard methodologies and overreaching conclusions in the social sciences. And today the subject is the unsettled and unsettling science of gender identity. So please welcome Dr. Mark Regnerus.
Delayed. Tonight I want to talk about a serious topic. Unfortunately, I have to talk about it in English because this is a drama. If I was going to do a comedy, I could try German. But I want to talk to you today about some of the science around gender and gender identity, and talking about some of the sort of basic terms, as well as sort of the ramifications. In some ways, I want to lean heavily on what's going on in the United States, because it feels as if we're a bellwether or kind of a predictor of what is going to happen further east of us. Although I feel like we got this from the United Kingdom. Her Majesty's colonies all seem similar in this respect. So in 2002, the European Union Court of Human Rights issued a landmark judgment in the case of Christine Goodwin versus the UK. Goodwin was biological male by birth who had undergone sex reassignment surgery 12 years prior. He sued over the change of sex not being legally recognized, not being able to retire at the age of women, and for privacy violations due to his birth certificate still showing that he was a biological male. The reason I'm bringing it up is not to go deep into legal cases, but just to point out that the request itself, outlandish though it may be, was fairly narrow. That was 20 years ago. Fast forward 18 years to 2020, Helena Dalli, the EU Commissioner for Equality, states that equality and non-discrimination are now fundamental human rights. She called for member states to develop strategies to promote these rights, particularly on behalf of sexual minority identified groups, LGBTIQ. She declared, quote, "Everybody in the European Union should feel safe and free without fear of discrimination or violence on the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics," unquote. This request was much more vague than the first one I mentioned, but it was far wider. This one wasn't narrow at all. In 2 quick decades, we've gone from case law with narrow applications to broad societal declarations, even thinly veiled commands about gender identity-based minority groups having rights and therefore requiring particular kinds of protections. But gender identity and gender expression are categorically different from sex, which sets up this collision about competing rights. None of this is what was envisioned with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the late 1940s. So we have to define our terms. We shouldn't have to. It is a signal that's something wrong when you have to go back to the basic definitions. But everything about this problem requires being very clear. And our opponents thrive on vagueness here. Sex refers to the biological sex distinctions that mark male and female as different. While it's fashionable to contest this, the sexual binary is unquestionable in terms of human reproduction. Females produce the large immobile gametes, and males produce the smaller immobile gametes, the birds and the bees, if you will. One can call oneself whatever one wishes, but if you are to reproduce, it is because you are a male or a female. Gender, on the other hand, is often construed as sort of an artificial imposition placed upon men and women by social and cultural expectations of them, with no absolute connection to biological sex. The idea is not new. However, while gender norms obviously vary across time, culture, and place, gender is not unrelated or artificially attached to sex. Gender is a social construction, but it builds upon nature, and it typically serves human needs. We were recently treated to an example of this in President Zelensky's February order for adult men to remain in Ukraine to resist the Russian invasion. We witnessed the rapid public renewal of dependence upon sex distinctions. To be sure, not all Ukrainian men felt like fighting. Some women did. But as I said, gender builds upon nature. Women were permitted to leave the country. They were not ordered to. Many did. Plenty did not. The policy seems to be working. Now consider gender identity, which the World Health Organization defines as a person's deeply felt, therefore subjective, internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond to the person's physiology or their designated sex at birth. Designated, assigned, as if a doctor assigns a sex to anybody. Gender identity is said to be a distinct reality, entirely separate from the material reality of the body. In other words, gender now belongs to the realm of this disembodied will, which now stands over the body in judgment and chooses an identity without any need for justification. The human person can now be a house divided against itself, the mind against one's own body. This slide is from a study of mine recently published in the Archives of Sexual Behavior. We used it to help explain some of the differences that we found in American adults' attitudes to the idea of treating adolescents with hormones or surgery for gender dysphoria. It comes down to some very basic differences in how people understand the human person, their body, and the ends for which we exist. In the progressive worldview, and I'll take this and explain it since you can't entirely see it. In the progressive worldview, there's sort of a dualism about the person. The self is inside a body, and the two may be divergent. A person can be born into the wrong body in this mentality, but the self has rule over the body. Humans have very few stable characteristics, which could be termed human nature, and some reject the idea of a human nature altogether. But you, as an essential self, can express yourself, can recreate yourself through body modification. Male and female themselves are matters of identity. I identify as male. Sex, of course, assigned at birth, may be reassigned different later by your own choice. Now, why did we come up with this explanation? Well, when we analyzed what American adults thought about the wisdom of treating adolescents with hormones or surgery, we put a lot of predictors into the model, trying to understand, and arguably the most effective predictor of what American adults thought about gender treatment was whether they self-identified to a completely different question as either pro-life or pro-choice. More than religion, more than politics, education, sex, age, it was their opinion about abortion that kind of surprised us. But then we thought back to an old book by the sociologist James Davison Hunter, old as in 30 plus years old, who he talks about in terms of the idea of culture wars, this notion of a progressive and an orthodox worldview. It worked then, and it seems to still work today on completely separate issues, but also those that concern the autonomy of the body. I happen to hold that the progressive convictions you see here are mistaken, some of them more mistaken than others. But they're not inconsequential. They're not mere preferences expressed within a system in which one can actually think and do whatever one wants. Instead, grave harm results where our social structures, governments, schools, even workplaces, grave harm results where these encourage such falsehoods about the human person. Eventually, these fictions can be established in law, and the population is required to be complicit with things that they know are not true empirically. So to legally construct gender identity is to allow material reality to be overwritten by an imagined reality. Now, how did we get here? I've talked about sex, gender, gender identity. Gender identity disorder first appeared as a medical diagnosis in 1994, serving as a replacement for the term transsexualism, with the hopes of lessening any stigma associated with that term. 20 years later, in the year 2013, gender identity disorder is replaced by gender dysphoria in order to problematize only the distress that people feel over their gender identity and not about the identity itself. Okay? So it's no longer a disorder, it's about sort of a difference or a distress. So the culturally dominant view of gender identity, as expressed in those recent EU declarations and legal cases, places gender dysphoria, a psychological diagnosis, under the auspices of minority rights. This is a legal and a political move that borrows from medicine at the same time that it denies that gender dysphoria is actually an illness. However, once you have successfully moved into the minority rights framework, you've moved away from the realm of medicine or psychiatry. Gender dysphoria is not so much a problem as it is considered distress. It is considered a condition best addressed by affirmation, psychologically, and medically. A prominent European LGBTQ student organization offers an example of this. Quote, gender confirmation treatment should be available and reimbursable. Treatments should be accessible and state-supported. It is crucial that there are no limitations, they italicized it, no limitations to access this treatment, such as the requirement to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria in order to have access to these treatments. Okay? If you see the logic of where this is going, gender confirmation treatment should not even need a diagnosis of dysphoria in order to access the treatment. But to be treated with particular medical procedures typically implies that there is something to be treated. It's hard to avoid this, since there are gatekeepers to the procedures themselves. But affirmative treatment is quickly moving away from any preliminary criteria except the declaration of a self-identity. That's the authoritative claim about one's own feelings and a desire for the treatment. In general, problems of the mind are not typically solved by medically altering or harming the body. But affirmative care means doing whatever the patient asks you to do. Physicians, endocrinologists, surgeons really ought to return to basic principles. First, do no harm. Compassionate care involves attending to psychological and psychiatric problems first. Medical treatments were once very uncommon in this domain and limited to adults. But now, gender identity ideology and transgender medicine are surging in children and youth. Youth are especially vulnerable because they're in a state of physical and emotional development. And yet they are encouraged to question their identity by both mainstream media, social media, and increasingly in schools. Many have been taught that biological sex is not an objective reality, that it is not binary. This ideological grooming and capture of an entire generation is now widespread in the United States. How successful have these efforts actually been? Johan had some of these statistics up earlier. In 2020, a Pew Research survey revealed that 1 in 6 Americans born between 1990 and 2002 identify as LGBT, with dramatic differences in trans identification between the generations. Some recent U.S. surveys have found as high as 10% of high schoolers identifying as transgender or gender nonconforming. Here are the UK gender referrals. But as Abigail Schreier's banned book, Irreversible Damage, describes, prior to these cultural changes, gender identity disorder among children was extremely rare, affecting less than 1/100% of the population. Most of those being natal boys. Studies have shown that if these children are simply left alone, the vast majority will naturally desist. That is, they will outgrow the dysphoria and accept their birth sex during puberty. In every study, the vast majority of kids, from 61 to 98%, grew out of it if the kids were left alone. But that is not the case anymore. Now, detransitioning is very unusual. So what happened? Over the past decade, there have been exponential increases in the number of children presenting at gender identity clinics with gender dysphoria. The United Kingdom experienced increases of 4,400%, Sweden 1,500% over a 10-year period. Same pattern playing out across many nations, no sign of slowing down. At the same time, the sex ratio has flipped, with far more natal females presenting than males. Collectively, thousands of young pubescent girls are suddenly discovering that they have been born in the wrong body. Although many exhibited no hint of gender dysphoria before adolescence. A preliminary observational study done in the United States coined this new phenomenon, rapid onset gender dysphoria. It was widely pilloried at the beginning when it was released until people have decided, like, okay, we'll kind of call that adolescent onset gender dysphoria. That study found intensive online exposure and social peer contagion to be consistent factors in whether the parent said that the child had reported being dysphoric. How do the affirmative gender clinicians explain all this? The surge cannot be attributed to pent-up demand. I've heard that one. That is, by suggesting that gender dysphoria simply went undiagnosed and was entirely stigmatized. So the tomboy of my youth, who could tackle me and play football better than I could, and I remember it, somehow she must have been transgender, but was just prohibited from, not from identifying as such, but from declaring it and seeking treatment. Well, today, she went on, got married, had a family. But that notion that somehow she must have been transgender escapes the imagination. They claim there is no risk to treating adolescents at puberty because puberty blockers are reversible. This will give kids time to think about it. They can always change their minds, right? But you can't help them change their mind because to be part of changing their mind about gender identity is now illegal in at least 20 United States. It's called gender identity conversion therapy. Yet the idea that it is somehow a conversion to decide that perhaps you were not born into the wrong body, that you may be able to live with the body that you have, this strains simple logic. But its impact is potent. It means that licensed psychologists are unable to help someone to come to terms with life in the body that they have, right? This is kind of the root of standard cognitive behavioral therapy, how to deal with your situation. But in this case, you can't do that. They are, however, free to help someone to seek the body that they want, that they desire, that they imagine. That's not illegal at all. But the childhood to adolescent years are critical periods of biological and brain development. And long-term physical effects of puberty blockers are virtually unknown. Most of the studies on this subject, very short-term. You've had puberty blockers, you've had cross-sex hormones. What do you think about your body 6 weeks later, 6 months later, maybe a year later? Not, what do you think about it 5 years later, 10 years later? You've had surgery to remove perfectly healthy tissue. What do you think about that 10 years later, 20 years later? We don't have science like that. Adolescence is also a crucial period of social development. Yet these children will be held up in a prepubescent state for 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, while they make up their mind. Meanwhile, their peers are moving forward with puberty, navigating the social milestones that are so common in adolescence. And what is an obvious extension of this trend, an Australian attorney and 6 of his co-authors recently made the ethical case for supporting the practice of ongoing pubertal suppression. That is, to, quote, permanently prevent the development of secondary sex characteristics as a way of affirming one's gender identity. You never have to go on to cross-sex hormones. You can just stay on puberty blockers. There should be no assumptions about what comes next in the affirmative treatment regime. In reality, instead of buying time to think about it, puberty blockers most often lock children in to a transgender pathway. Gone are the days of vast majority desistance rates and kids becoming comfortable with their own bodies because they went through puberty. Now they are not. Now 98% of children put on puberty blockers move on to cross-sex hormones. Why? Because it all happens so much earlier, before any experience of your natal puberty. But it remains an experimental procedure with a high likelihood of changing the life path of the child. Very unpredictable effects on mental and physical health, suicidality, and life expectancy. Claims that it is a civil right, that a civil right is at stake, do not change the fact that what is proposed is a social and a medical experiment. A British woman named Kiara Bell is a key example of this. Put on puberty blockers at age 16, then cross-sex hormones, and at age 20 had a double mastectomy, all with her permission, her consent, but all of which she now deeply regrets. In 2020, she sued, saying that she had been rushed into transition, was not given therapeutic options, lacked the capacity to understand the long-term implications of her decisions. In her words, I was an unhappy girl who needed help. Instead, I was treated like an experiment. One of the more well-known affirmative clinician researchers in the United States jokes around this, saying, it doesn't matter if you have your breast removed. You can get artificial breasts later. But in terms of harm, one of the most egregious is with respect to children's fertility potential. Eventually, transgender medicine sterilizes minors. In so doing, human rights abuses are being committed in the name of medical autonomy. This is not theoretical. It's actual. And it's not okay just because they consented. How does anyone justify such drastic interventions on children? They do so by weaponizing the risk of suicide among the gender dysphoric and claiming that gender affirmative treatments are life-saving. Gender dysphoria, however, is not cancer. It is not a malignancy. Cancer, on the other hand, is not fundamentally a psychological problem. Suicide is being put into service to a political end. We shouldn't be surprised by this. Indeed, it's part of the conceptual veiling that aids the capture of professional organizations like the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and with them, policy shifts, legal protections put into practice. refusing to give minors puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or any of a host of surgical procedures will not kill them, as many seem to imply. Oxford University sociologist Michael Biggs re-examined the UK Gender Clinic's data on suicides, and he found, very recently, earlier this year, the number of completed suicides among patients at the UK clinic to be so small that he concluded that it is irresponsible to exaggerate the prevalence of suicide. A former senior clinician in that clinic agreed. She warned about what happens to children, quote, when inaccurate data and alarmist opinion are conveyed very authoritatively to families, such as the common phrase that clinicians often pose to parents with a dysphoric child. Would you rather have a living son or a dead daughter? It puts families in a bind, all the more given how common early trauma is in such households. 7 endocrinologists and a gender clinic in Australia were discussing the characteristics of children at the clinic. They noted a high number of conflicted family situations and documented trauma. In fact, only 5% of their sample was believed to exhibit healthy levels of functioning. 20 years ago, what is known as the Dutch protocol for treating minors refused to give hormones to children with apparent psychiatric conditions. So we applied that to the Australian case. 95% of the children at that clinic would be ruled out for starting hormones because they had underlying psychiatric conditions. First, they had to be treated for anxiety, depression, self-harming behaviors. Today, no more. Not in the affirmative care era. Now, clinicians claim that the anxiety and the depression and the self-harm are not because of the dysphoria. Rather, they're because of you. It's the stigma they feel around them. So the prescription is to fight the stigma socially, politically, and treat the patient, and presume that the gender dysphoria will be quieted by hormonal treatments and surgery. But it's a no-win situation for you, because any remaining problems after they've treated with hormones and surgery, any remaining differences are blamed on stigma. It's become the catch-all answer. But what do gender dysphoric children really need? They need compassion. They need proper therapy. They need slow care. Their parents need to sever their connection to the internet and social media and to live in the real material world. They need help addressing the problems in their lives. Their bodies are not to blame, and you are not to blame. But convincing them of that is rather difficult. My research assistant recently counted over 40,000 online fundraising appeals for double mastectomy surgery costs. Tens of thousands of young women seeking to amputate healthy breasts in search of personal identity or relief from body hatred or distress. You can imagine then that there are now thousands of young people like Kiara Bell who regret their transition. Due to these known harms, unclear benefits, and far too many unknowns, some countries like Finland and Sweden have actually slowed down their affirmative pathway as the standard treatment for minors. In 2020, Finland officially began recommending psychotherapy as the first line of treatment for gender dysphoria. Meanwhile, in the United States, we're starting to drop the recommendation for psychological therapy. Sweden will not allow interventions for those under 18 except in strictly controlled clinical trials. In the United States, they reject doing clinical trials. Several American states are now seeking to enact legislative bans to protect minors from such medical experimentation. That doesn't prevent scientists from trying to prove the efficacy of hormones and surgery. This is where I come in. I turn my gaze on the science itself, how the scientists do their work. I'll give you an example. A study based on a very large and comprehensive data set appeared in 2020 in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Sounds prestigious? It is prestigious. Its authors tracked every dysphoric case in Sweden over years, and they measured patients' subsequent use of mental health treatment. First, what they found was no evidence that initiating hormone treatment helped reduce subsequent use of mental health treatment. But the authors did conclude that gender-affirming surgery was in fact helpful. It was associated with needing less mental health treatment. In other words, it looked like the surgery helped patients. At least the authors thought so. In fact, they were so confident that in their conclusions, they declared, this study provides timely support for policies that ensure coverage of gender-affirming treatments. They kind of packaged hormones and surgery together, although it didn't show anything with the hormones. I read this study carefully. I could not see how they could justify such a confident interpretation of the data. Just looking at the published results, doing a little figuring with a calculator, I could tell that if a mere 3 additional cases had sought mental health treatment, there would be no statistically discernible effect of surgery on subsequent mental health needs. The effect was that tiny and that fragile. 3 cases. I was also able to calculate something called the number needed to treat, or NNT, which is a measure of clinical impact. It helps doctors make decisions about whether a particular treatment is worth it. A high NNT, in terms of numbers, accompanied by significant risk in the treatment itself, is considered a bad bet. On the other hand, a high NNT accompanied with very small risk, for example, taking a daily statin pill for high cholesterol, is considered simply low risk. It doesn't help that many people, but there's barely any risk to it. Ideally, you want an NNT of 1. For every person who is treated, that person is helped. But that almost never happens. Even treating sinus infections with antibiotics typically yields an NNT around 7 or so. But in this study of Sweden, the NNT, I calculated it. A psychiatrist called me up and said, Mark, calculate the NNT for that. I'm like, okay, do it. 49 is the NNT, meaning the beneficial effect of transgender surgery is so small that a clinic would have to perform 49 surgeries, in reality there are sets of surgeries, before they should expect to witness 1 less patient seeking subsequent mental health care. Now, if no other treatment was available, or if the treatment was non-invasive, hazards small, clinics might consider surgery a low-risk but low-payoff approach. But even the most common surgeries are considered major surgeries. Some are exceptionally challenging. But conducting surgery on 49 patients in order to secure 1 better outcome It's absurd. And for the authors of this study to claim that their study supports gender-affirming treatments, that's unethical. That's wrong. I wasn't the only one who saw this. The journal itself received numerous letters pointing out that the study's analyses were problematic, overreaching conclusions unsupported by weak data. A year later, the American Journal of Psychiatry published 7 letters of critique, an editorial note that it was undergoing statistical re-review, which all prompted a correction, not a retraction. I thought it deserved a retraction, but a correction. Now, were the authors professionally harmed by this experience? Have journal editors begun to scrutinize the evidence here a little more carefully? No, nothing like that happened. On the contrary, very little threatens this new line of lucrative, lifelong medical dependency. What can we make of this? Well, it's evidence for something I call ideological capture, meaning the corruption of authority by the successful takeover of professional organizations by activists. In this case, the academic journals and the professional organizations that typically give rise to those, like the American Psychological Association, American Journal of Academy of Pediatrics, they are committed to certain conclusions regardless of the data. That study went through peer review. The editor saw it. Everybody could have calculated the same things I did, and they kept their mouth shut. Entire organizations are disregarding outcomes that are not consistent with the ideologically motivated sense of rightness and justice. Such ideological capture is toxic to the dissent and open debate that is critical to healthy medical and social science. This is just not how medical research is supposed to work. The ideological capture of gender dysphoria is also apparent in the efforts to re-educate people in the use of identity language by the rapid formulation of a premature consensus in these societies, by the explosion in gender clinics across the US. This is in 2007, 2. This is today, between 200 and 300. By the suppression of open debate, all of it couched in fear. Fear of appearing unsophisticated, unprofessional, too conservative, bigoted. I get that fear. I'm accused of that with some regularity, but I'm not going to be afraid of it anymore. Take the example of the controversy over the American television news program 60 Minutes. For a long time, one of the most popular shows on TV. May of last year, 2021, they ran a segment on detransitioners. You would think it is healthy to have an open public discussion regarding patients who have undergone a gender transition, but who wish to transition back to their natal sex. Not only did activists seek to prevent the 60 Minutes segment from appearing, but so did well-known, well-published researchers. Leslie Stahl, the lead interviewer for the segment, an award-winning journalist for 30 years, said that she couldn't remember another story, quote, where comments and criticisms began surfacing from advocates before the segment even appeared. It's one thing to criticize it after it comes out. This, they wanted to suppress it from ever being released in the first place. Even book reviews are being retracted and withdrawn. Books, yes. Now book reviews of those books. Certain conclusions are penalized both professionally and in the wider and social economic marketplace. My own research division at the University of Texas at Austin recently sent us all guidance about how we ought to talk about transgender youth. They've never done that about any topic in the 20 years I've been employed there. To think that such external and political pressure do not affect the conduct of basic social and medical research would be naive. They're telling you, here are the answers you ought to come up with. It's not just about treatments either, but the very language we use to understand the human person. Already in 2014, a senior clinician at the UK Gender Clinic observed how vagueness infuses this language of transgender. She said, the meaning of trans is constantly shaped and reshaped, but it rests on no foundation of truth. The therapist is not burdened with the need to be right or the need to be certain, but only to help clients explore their gendered worldview. In conclusion, gender ideology is an assault upon reality, a demand for the power to define human beings and human bodies as one wishes or deems them to be, not as they actually are. When considering broad societal changes, authentic human flourishing should be the mark and the measure of social progress. In this, the concept of gender identity completely misses the mark. Gender identity is a destructive premise because it is false. The field of adolescent transgender medicine is saturated by conflict over these competing values. High-quality longitudinal research over time is rare. Randomized clinical trials with control groups, non-existent. American professional societies promote affirmative treatment strategies not because the data over long-term studies shows it's helpful, but in part due to a demand-driven medical culture in which emphasis is being placed on liking what one sees in the mirror, or increasingly, how other people respond to your selfie. Meanwhile, the basics of the explosion in gender dysphoria, especially among natal girls, remains understudied, perhaps now on purpose. Minors' ability to consent is wielded in ideologically motivated ways. This is not how healthy medical research operates. Time in the US is short. New standards are being issued this year for the treatment of adolescent gender dysphoria, ones that lower the recommended ages for particular treatments, down to age 15 for chest masculinization surgery, age 16 for breast augmentation and facial surgeries, age 17 for hysterectomy, vaginoplasty, metoidoplasty, bottom surgery for female to male patients. All of these under age 18. Keep in mind, these are recommendations. They're not laws. They're not even rules. They're suggestions. Frankly, they've already been the norm out there. But for years, it was considered too blunt to admit it. So they hid behind standards and claimed, without evidence, that they were being followed. But they're more confident now, hence relaxing down to younger ages. The sterilization of minors is still widely understood among the population to be morally wrong, but there's a lot of confusion about it. But we're not talking about normal times anymore. We're talking about exceptional times. The same rules just do not apply here. I want to conclude with the remarks of a late sociologist who taught at the university that I got my degree from. He was an atheist who was actually agnostic about the proper diagnosis and treatment of gender dysphoria. He said he really didn't care. But he understood well what gender ideology was capable of. 20 years ago in the top journal, which would never happen today, 20 years ago in the top journal in sociology, he wrote, "Human beings form their social structures around gender because males and females have different and biologically influenced behavioral predispositions." Fairly standard. Societies demonstrate wide latitude here. They can accentuate gender, they can minimize it, or they can leave it alone. If they ignore it, it doesn't go away. If they depart too far from the underlying reality of biological predispositions, they will generate what he called social malaise, social pressures to drift back towards closer alignment with biology. And then he concluded with a chilling prediction. He asserted that any social engineering program to degender society would require what he called a Maoist approach, continuous revolutionary resolve, and a tolerance for conflict. I do see some tolerance for conflict out there already, but I'm not sure I see enough of it. The very distinction between man and woman is at risk today, not in the minds of average people, but in the minds of the elite. And culture change is not driven by average people, it's driven by elites. You think all this will go away quietly? I wish it were true. I urge you to do everything in your power to protect Austria's sons and daughters from these harms. Write your member of parliament, register complaints, praise and thank those who are acting prudently and wisely here, and talk about these things in your household. I'll leave you with the remarks of one of my favorite priests, gone 40 years now. He wrote, "In the national life, there are two things which are really essential: the laws concerning marriage and the laws to do with education. In these areas, God's sons and daughters have to stand firm and fight with toughness and fairness for the sake of all mankind." And if he had been able to envision this, he would have added to marriage and education the fundamental idea of distinctions between men and women. But he could not have imagined that 40 years ago. I'll stop there and I'll start taking, I guess, the most popular questions that appear on the screen. Thanks. Right, would you like me to just read them off? Or are you reading them off?
I will try to read them. So right now the question with the highest score from Samuel Klapproth: how reliable is the data about suicide rates related to gender dysphoria and medical alteration?
Right. In terms of reliability, it's challenging here because you have suicidality, you have suicide attempts, and then you have completed suicides, right? Obviously, I think the best information will be gathered with regards to, the best is in the most significant here, from completed suicides. However, of course, you cannot talk to these people. You can only gather information from like the gender clinic, like the UK. Better to then move towards suicide attempts because you can actually talk to the patient. But most of what we see out there, and the thing I talked about with Michael Biggs in Oxford, was around completed suicides and with regard to the documentation about those patients. A tiny fraction. More than would be expected in the general population. I'm not going to suggest that it's not associated. But he said the actual risk, which is not suicidality, which is once or twice, or more than once or twice, thinking about suicide as a plausible option for yourself over time. It's a time span of what? A month, a year, a lifetime? Most of what we're treated to is the association between gender dysphoria and suicidality. But suicidality is fairly far removed from actual attempts and completions. The best data you'll get are about completions. But most of what we're treated to in the literature is suicidality. It's kind of weaponized that, they could think about this, with the implication that if they think about this, some of them will actually carry it out. But the gap between thinking about it and carrying out is rather distant. A lot of people, myself included, have given serious thought to the idea more than once in a lifetime, right? But that doesn't mean we're at imminent risk of an attempt or a completion. But most of the data is about suicidality.
So now we have another top question from Suha. Who pushes and promotes gender dysphoria among young people? And what are the benefits for the stakeholders and lobbyists?
Right. I'm not so sure I know the answer to the second question. And it's not so much that they promote dysphoria, right? But in the United States, it's not that we're encouraging dysphoria, but we're finding that more and more children and adolescents feel like they are born into the wrong body, okay? Some of them don't seem to have a problem with that, but most of the time you think, this makes me uncomfortable. I'm heading towards puberty from what people tell me, and I don't want to experience that. The thought frightens me, okay? And so this is sort of gender dysphoria. It provides a mental discomfort to the notion, okay? And so people aren't encouraging dysphoria. Dysphoria happens, okay? And it's happening more frequently with sort of the online internet era and the pronounced social media that children and young adults are involved with, okay? So, and it kind of even more exploded in the last 2 years with the COVID thing, sending us all home, sending everybody online. So that increased it even further. So people aren't really pushing it, although some people online are encouraging anybody who thinks it that perhaps you have gender dysphoria. The real thing that's happening is that gender dysphoria is now no longer the first step to getting psychological help and then thinking about, well, what do you want to do next? You don't even have to declare gender dysphoria. You have to say, I am declaring an identity. And the affirmative clinical community says, you declare the identity, you should be eligible for the treatments, right? That's not typically how medicine works. Medicine want a diagnosis of a problem, but now you don't even have to declare a problem, except that, like, I don't fit in this body.
So now a question for myself. 7 votes, that's good. How can we help young girls who struggle with their identity?
You know, I'm a sociologist, not a psychologist, so I don't really have a good answer to that question. I can tell how we deal with it in our household, okay? You know, I have 2 daughters. One's 23, 21, and one's 13. They never seem to have struggled powerfully with a sort of an identity. But one of the things that we had always made sure is, well, they certainly didn't get a phone fast, right? You know, not at least until you were driving, okay? So the 13-year-old does not have access to that, does not have access to social media, does not have access to, email only, right? And so I think we prevent some problems just by sort of basic sort of lack of exposure, right? Some of her friends have this. She knows her friends have more issues around this stuff than she does, okay? So I think some of it can be fostered. Now, it doesn't solve the problem like, well, what happens when it has already occurred, okay? Again, I'm not a psychologist, So, you know, I knew you were going to ask that question. I probably should have consulted a psychologist or a psychotherapist. Now, another thing I want to put in a pitch for, though, is I don't have any financial stake in this, but there's a program called Canavox, based out of Princeton, New Jersey, that I don't know if there are such clubs in Germany yet, but I have found them very helpful. Okay? They're discussion groups. They started of discussion groups among mothers, and then they've become discussion groups among teenage girls with sort of an adult guidance and instruction, and teenage boys, same thing, adult guidance and suggestion. So they're guided by adults who are well-versed in this stuff. It's a free forum for kids to pose questions and seek answers to this. I was somewhat skeptical at first, and then I just listened in a little bit on my daughter, the 13-year-old, on this program. I was very impressed at the high level of discussion, the seriousness with which they take each other, and you know, it gave her a language, right? She started hearing these things around school, but like it gave her a language with which she could debate and discern what the good was and what it wasn't. So I thought that helped.
Thank you. Another question with 7 votes. What can we do as society and as politicians to prevent further increase of gender dysphoria and reassignment surgeries among minors? What helps?
Right. I can think of a couple things, right? First, do no harm, right? In the United States, sort of we've smoothed the pathway from these medical professional organizations to recommending particular treatments for gender dysphoria or even just simple gender identity declarations. Okay? So don't do harmful things legally, politically. However, I do think some things are plausible here. I mean, what we're seeing with the treatment of adolescents, both with long enough time on hormones, including cross-sex hormones, certainly with surgery, is you're talking about sterilization of minors. You know what? If I had talked about this 30, 40 years ago, we were talking about sterilization of minors, we would have been fairly recently removed from Nazi experimentation in the Second World War. We would have been horrified by it. Now I say it, it just kind of hits people, bounces off. But we're talking about the permanent prevention of fertility in a minor, some of whom have never even experienced puberty. This is ridiculous. This is immoral, unethical. It should be illegal, right? That's an idea. And this idea, I think that a lot of people could get behind. Like, do no harm. Don't sterilize minors, even if they say they consent to it. We have to think about, like, oh, what is the age of consent here? How old do you have to be before you can choose to do this? There are physicians in the United States, urologists, who refuse to give vasectomies to 20, 25-year-old men who have no children, aren't married, because they think, you know what, you might change your mind someday. Of course, there are prospecting surgeons who are willing to do it. But I think, you know, if we think ahead about, like, what should people be able to consent to? As an extension to this, okay, I study sexual behavior, relationship decision-making, primarily. If a child is able to consent to their own sterilization and the cutting off of their genitalia, how could we possibly think they aren't also able to consent to sexual behavior of various sorts as a teenager, 12, 13, 14 years old? If they can consent to being sterilized and surgery performed, how in the world could you legally say you can't have sex with somebody over the age of 20, 25, 30? Rationally doesn't make sense that the one thing can be okay and the other thing can't, right? Age of consent laws are teetering. They're very weak today. I think consent in this domain should be much higher than it is.
Okay, now we have some question with 6 votes. And one is about the German language. It starts to be expected more and more at university to show gender diversity by writing SchülerInnen, also the and using the star. Now it got removed. So much happening here.
It's very dynamic.
So what's the question? Sorry. Yeah, it went up. The star is signifying gender diversity. Any advice how to deal with it? And maybe, just
right. Please. Sure. This may not completely satisfy, but at the University of Texas, we're encouraged to declare our personal pronouns. I don't. I mean, how often do people address me as him, he, his, right? I don't address students with she, her, hers. I address them by their name, right? And if I was uncomfortable with that, I'd address them by their last name, okay? It's just not a fundamental issue for me at the University of Texas. So I basically say, get creative here. Think about your way around things that you don't want to do, right? You can do this. Plus, we're talking about a pretty minor lift here, right? If you can't figure out ways to object in a small way, how are we going to collectively reject some of the bigger stuff that's coming down the pike in this domain?
And a similar question here, what would be your career advice for a young academic researching this topic? It might destroy their career based on non-academic standards.
Yeah, I get that. As an example, I recently tried to hire a postdoc at the University of Texas, and she came from a very good population studies-based program. She likes the kind of research I do, but her advisor and another of her dissertation readers refused to write her a recommendation letter for future positions if she came to Texas to work with me, which is sad. It saddened her, it frustrated her, but I didn't blame her for saying, Mark, I can't come. I need this, okay? Yeah, it is sensitive. So I don't tell people, how to conduct their professional lives. But I did tell her, and I encourage people in this domain, you can't tell lies. You can't endorse things that you know to be wrong in print, okay? I think there's a lot of sort of people out there who do studies in this or related areas who are uncomfortable with it, and yet they go along to get along. They think about, like, my job is the most important thing, my livelihood, my ability to feed my family. You know what? You can find another job, right? There's lots of jobs out there. If you have to lie and suppress the truth to make a living, maybe you're not in the right line of work. So either you have to be able to sort of speak truth to power, not all the time, right? I don't use every opportunity I get, I don't do it. But I pick my battles. Be shrewd about it, but you can't not do it.
Thank you. Another question here, Samuel Klapproth. Gender-related confusion, jokes, mocking, willful misunderstanding seems to play a considerable role in today's media entertainment, a regular element in family sitcoms. Does this contribute to gender dysphoria? Gender dysphoria, okay, sorry.
No idea. I have no idea. It boggles the mind at some level, logically, to think about that sitcoms will sort of really resonate, especially in terms of joking, with impressionable teenagers. I think more likely the case is sort of conversations on social media, YouTube, etc. But then, I'm not a person who studies media influence on particular kinds of behavior.
Then we have a question here from Johannes. Would you not say that it's possible to be born in the wrong body? Is this not a phenomenon that could happen in a not perfect world?
Not perfect world.
Is this if this is possible, how could we help these people?
If it's
Thanks.
possible to be born in the wrong body.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to be born in the wrong body, although, you know, the creation has troubles, okay? People are born with all sorts of medical complications, situations, problems, disorders. One of the things that people talk about here, they equate the intersex condition with sort of being a cousin to sort of being born in the wrong body, gender dysphoria, etc. But like, that is a disorder of sexual development, right? It's a problem. It wasn't meant to be that way. But when you think about if you were born with a healthy body, but you think I was born into the wrong body, then we're talking about kind of almost like a worldview distinction here, right? Back to that early slide I had up there. To think that, you know, my self is essentially not connected to my body, but like myself is somehow in my body, right? And that I can do things to my body in order to get it to work the way I want. Like that's fundamentally a kind of a worldview distinction from the notion that one's body and one's mind are part of the same thing, right? People of faith will say body, mind, and soul are all one, right? It doesn't mean you can't have mental difficulties. It doesn't mean you can't experience dysphoria. But I fundamentally don't think like, wow, somebody could be born into a completely wrong body. Now, back to what I talked about at the beginning. You may feel more masculine or feminine, okay? I don't drive a Ford F-150 truck and I'm from Texas, okay? My son likes to hunt. I like to sit in the house and read, okay? I wanted a bake oven when I was a kid and I didn't get one. But it doesn't mean that somehow any sort of traces of femininity versus classic masculinity somehow makes me more of a woman, makes me wonder, like, maybe I'm not made the right way. It's just sort of, these are preferences, okay? Men and women have long exhibited preferences around this domain, and yet they remained male and female, right?
Another question here. In some Christian communities, gender roles and some stereotypes are encouraged. Can this contribute to children feeling like they are in the wrong body? Should we rethink those gender roles?
Well, it's kind of a sweeping sort of indictment in some ways. Yeah, and gender roles are encouraged, regardless of Christian communities or not. Like, people encourage gender roles in their kids. And can it lead to dysphoria? Probably not dysphoria. It may be out of step, right? You know, I couldn't bring myself to tell my mother that I wanted the bake oven for Christmas because I thought, well, they probably wouldn't think that was a good idea for a boy. So I didn't do it. Did I, was I racked by guilt over this? And I think I didn't come to that conclusion, okay? Parents and communities, whether schools, colleges, universities, churches, are going to sort of foster gender roles of sorts. You can contest those if you wish. Does it mean they should wholesale get rid of them? I don't see any particular reason for that. You don't have to follow them if that's not what you really sense. So I don't want to sort of openly undermine organizations' kind of commitments to certain notions.
Thank you.
Everything's got 7. We need like an 8 or 9 to really
Yeah,
top
there
this
are no
off.
8 or
Come
9.
on.
Yeah. We still have 50 minutes planned for questions, so we will see if we use that time. A question for myself. How is it possible that the biological differences between women and men are being ignored? How do they get away with that? What can we do to make the obvious truth clear to everyone?
Yeah, this is a difficult question. I mean, basically, there's been a problematization of sort of a basic distinction between men and women. It's chromosomal, XXXY. The pushback in this domain is like, oh, we have for so long taken a simplistic understanding of sex. Sex, yes, involves chromosomes, it involves genitalia, but it also involves identity and one's sense of oneself. So people are making complex something that was kind of, for the longest time, considered fairly straightforward, right, and observable, right? So I'm not crazy about that. I think there's like 6 or 8 distinctions or facets we call for basic sex today among not so much clinicians, but scholars of gender, right? I don't agree with that, right? So how did that go wrong? Well, that's a longer story, involves history and culture and gender. But it's not that they're being ignored, it's that people are transforming, especially elites and scholars, are transforming the very definition of what sex is. Not the binary male-female, but sort of more of a spectrum of sex. I'm comfortable with the spectrum of gender because gender is about preferences, right, which vary between men and women. But adding a spectrum to binary sex makes no sense to me. Makes no sense to a lot of people. Makes no sense to the average people. Makes no sense to a majority of the world's elites, many of whom are keeping their mouth shut now because it doesn't seem kosher to suggest otherwise.
But how can we make the obvious truth and clear to everyone? I mean, I also watched a video where one student asked other students in Sweden, if I say I'm a woman, say I'm a man, am I a man then? And they said yes. And I said, okay, if I say I'm Chinese, am I then a Chinese? And they said no, So it was a Swedish woman, So I mean, it's true that just what you're saying cannot just change real matters. And why it's so obvious that it's strange that it's hard to show, really. I mean,
right. We want some sort of we want the clinicians to sort of declare that sex is fairly straightforward. They're not going to do that anymore, so far as I can tell, because they're being co-opted by this sort of ideological, premature consensus. But I think we just have to, cooler heads have to prevail, and we have to keep saying that sex is binary. It requires a male and a female to reproduce. Regardless of what you say about yourself, if reproduction happens, it's not because of anything you said about yourself or what you felt about yourself. It's because you are a male or a female.
Okay, thanks. Then we have a question here from Rose. A little boy come dressed in address to kindergarten. It's not addressed by the teachers. How do we respond towards the kindergarten? What do I explain my toddler who is in the group and 4 years old? So it's a personal question.
Yeah, sociologist, do I give advice on how to deal with a 4-year-old in school? I have not encountered this in my personal orbit, so it's a tough thing to sort of say, well, here's how I handled it, right? If you don't like it, you can let the teacher know, you can let the principal, the superintendent, the school board. You have every right to do that. They may not side with you, but then also along the way, you have to talk to your children about this. You have to, if you don't like it, explain why you don't like it. This is why I pushed the idea of this Canavox.com, these groups. They help give kids and parents sort of a language with which to contest this in a compassionate, fair, but straightforward kind of way. So, no, I don't think you have to keep your mouth shut, but you don't, of course, have control over what other kids wear or what the teacher and the schools will permit, right? So, but you don't have to just passively sit back and say, well, my daughter's going to think whatever she wants to think, right? You're the parents. Instruct the children in the way you think they should go. When they're old, they won't depart from it.
I think that was a biblical quote.
I'm Catholic. I don't know where in the Bible it is, but I know it's there.
Me neither. So Then we have a question. What topics related to sex and gender are coming in the near future, maybe because it's already in the US, that we need to start thinking about now?
Well, one of the things that may or may not happen, it depends, you know, I don't understand the Austrian healthcare system. The American healthcare system, which conservatives will back free market till the day they die, but the free market system has really brought us 300 gender clinics throughout the country, okay? So it's partly a function of how the health management system is designed. That's a problem that itself elsewhere. That leads us to sort of not knowing exactly how big the problem is in the United States, whereas in the UK they have one clinic, large backlog of cases, but they can kind of keep track of things and have national information, same with Sweden, same with Finland. In the US, we just know that it's a big issue. We don't really know how many cases there are because there's no national reporting standards. All right, that doesn't really help answer the question of what's the topics that are coming in the near future. Well, I think sort of earlier ages, easier transitions for children to make, schools going behind the backs of parents, teachers not telling parents what they're noticing. You know, in the United States, there's a lot of public school teachers in particular who are being complicit with fostering gender identity distinctions among children and not letting the parents know about this. So parents, and I'm from Texas, most progressive town in Texas, but parents are kind of ticked off that some of these things are happening in schools and they are not privy to that information. Professor of mine back in graduate school said, you know, schools seem to be about the effort of separating children culturally, socially, emotionally from their parents, right, and politically. I think he's probably right. Parents need to know what's going on in their kids' schools. So when I was a kid, not to wax sentimental, but like if my parents wanted to come into my school, they walked in the front door. I don't think they even had to stop at the principal's office. They knew where my class was. Now the door's locked, or you have to go into the principal's office first, get permission. I mean, a whole lot of things to be able to see what your flesh and blood offspring is being taught. And frankly, that's kind of disturbing when it comes to this domain.
Okay, we have some more free votes questions. Here one, what can we do as a church, Christian community to prevent gender dysphoria from increasing?
Well, it's not, so my opponents will say it's not socially infectious. I think they're just flat wrong. Of course it's socially infectious. Lots of people are learning about this stuff from, they'll say, oh, they learn about it from the internet because they already have it, right? Maybe it suggests to them that they might have it because they're learning about it from the internet, okay? I think it is socially infectious, but you know, good ideas are also socially infectious. There's just no replacement for talking to your own children and sort of your children being in good relationship with other adults you trust, okay? One of the most important things, and I've noticed it in sort of my wider religious community, parents who don't trust other parents, even good parents, they don't get reinforcement for their own ideas. And I have seen so many of those kids go off one way or the other because they basically entrusted parenting only to themselves, not to their adult friends. I think it's a disaster. One of the best things my 23-year-old son ever experienced was my best friend's advice to him. Hunting trips they would take, and he would talk to him about things like, it had to come from him, not from me, because other adults in your life are really, really important, okay? So, in terms of Christian community, well, make sure your children have exposure to other adults you trust, who reinforce your ideas. I think that's pivotally important, because there comes a time when, like, they don't really believe you anymore. I don't know what's 13, 14, 15, till about 21, 22, then all of a sudden you're the genius. But there's a time when that it's not you that's the authoritative voice. It's other people's voices. Try to make sure that they are hearing good people's voices.
Good advice. Another question, did brain research confirm any of the gender thesis?
Okay. That's a little vague of a question. By brain research, I'm guessing we're talking about like MRI-based things where brain parts light up, etc. I've never really known what to make of those things. I don't deny that, you know, if it is real in your mind, it may show up real on, you know, parts of the brain may light up different, but, you know, I never know what to make of these kind of brain research. They never actually sort of suggest sort of a solution. Suggest that, we can map some things that go on inside the brain in different kinds of people. So those are sort of blunt instruments, and we're talking about a lot more narrow kinds of things, like particular diagnoses, particular expressions of suicidality, self-reported attempts. All these things seem too narrow and fine-grained for what I would call like blunt instruments about MRIs lighting up parts of the brain. Again, I really don't know what to do with that kind of research. It doesn't ever suggest, oh, this is the approach that we should take because this part lit up.
Okay, now we have a question from Helmut Resch. Slightly different topic, but maybe similar. How do you respond to studies who claim that there are no negative effects of non-hetero parents? Where are the differences? We need arguments to defend your study.
That was so 10 years ago. Sorry. This is a reference to a study I published in the journal Social Science Research back in 2012, 10 years ago next month. That was widely criticized, but it remains in print. There's no correction on it. There's no retraction on it. People say it's debunked. It's not debunked. There's disputes about the meaning of it. Fundamentally, after all that harassment, and it was harassment, it reveals a couple differences. One is questions about how one measures gay or lesbian households, what it means to raise children, especially in households that exhibit all manner of comings and goings, household disruptions, and what's the proper way of analyzing, statistically analyzing, effects of something. So ultimately, the story back then was about the disrupted nature of gay and lesbian households. The question is a lot more stable today than they were a generation ago. I don't know. I mean, that's an empirical question, okay? But once you control for household instability, kids tend to fare better. We always knew that, right? The fundamental question is about household instability. Typically speaking, the data and all this stuff, and I wrote a follow-up article just a couple years ago kind of about how to analyze this and what you find when that happens. You find that households with two mothers, well, one's going to be likely a birth mother and the other a social mother, exhibit more emotional problems and greater household breakup levels than a man and a woman or two men. Two men, you see a lot more sort of, there's not sexual fidelity in the same way that is when there's any household involving women, right? This is because it's basically a sex distinction, right? Get back to talking about sexual distinctions between men and women. So, but none of those kinds of households can have sort of true, genuine, complete kinship network, right? Between a biological mother and a biological father. So I was accused of, back then, of, you're comparing apples to oranges. Well, I did say I wanted to look at what might be a gold standard. When mom and dad are married together permanently, how do those kids look? They looked pretty good, okay, compared to all those other groups. Again, wasn't retracted, it was widely criticized, but it remains in print because what is stated there is true and accurate. So how do I help you defend that? I don't know. 10 years in, I've learned a lot in this domain. It's impossible for me to study on it because to publish on it because no editor wants to undergo the abuse that my late editor experienced. So I don't know what to tell you about that, except what you read there is not false.
Okay, the last question, I think. Then it's 2015. From Suva, what are the causes of the high gender dysphoria in the US?
Oh,
Can this development be stopped?
Yeah, the causes, not well known, partly because the people who are kind of responsible for studying gender dysphoria medically have no vested interest in actually knowing the roots causes of it, okay? Because the affirmative medical community doesn't believe it's a problem. So if people can't agree that it is a problem to be solved, then we're not going to be very effective in understanding what are the roots of it, what are the causes of it. It's going to be mere speculation on my part, but I think if we could power down access to devices, access to frankly, I think Instagram is really, really, really bad for girls. I have a 21-year-old daughter who puts it on the phone, takes it off the phone. Puts it on the phone, takes it off the phone, okay? I'm pretty sure she's not unusual in that. She's attracted to it, and she's repulsed by it. She knows that it's not good for her, but she also likes to know what her friends are doing. I don't think it's quite as toxic for boys. So when you think about the sex ratio flip that happened about a decade, 15 years ago, I think it came about by sort of the wide access to imagery of people, right? And at a socially sensitive age when people care about well, what do I look like, right? I mean, the era of puberty is an awkward age, okay? And I was a boy, I knew I wasn't all that handsome. I'm so much better now, of course. But if I had sort of been just constantly exposed, if I cared a lot and was constantly exposed to image after image after image, who knows what I would have thought about 15, when I was 12, 13, 14. So I think that has a role to play. But if you think anything's going to happen to the big social media companies like that, we're mistaken, okay? They are our digital overlords. I don't want to end on that. Sorry.
So
we need something better.
I give you can say last few words if you want.
Yeah. I have learned over the past decade that you have to resist if you see that something is fundamentally, empirically objectionable, or if there is a connection between things that just look to be wrong. Okay? I decided not to be quiet, but I also decided not to speak up whenever I felt like it, but to think before speaking, to study before speaking. But failure to say something, I think, is not an option, right? People just have to have some courage. And frankly, once you've kind of been bitten, once you've been sort of experienced digital hostility, you get used to it. It never feels good, never feels good. But you also understand, I can deal with that. I can put up with that, right? Far worse could happen to me, okay? I can put up with that. Right? You have to learn to take it on the chin a little bit. So, I'm not accusing you folks of this, but this is what I've learned in a decade of sort of starting to say things that I saw going wrong in the discipline and in the social science on sexuality, sexual relationship behavior, and now this stuff. I just encourage people to sort of grow some courage and start displaying some courage. And people like to know that that it mattered. Okay, you don't have to write me and say thank you, professor, for this talk. But 10 years ago, people wrote me. Social scientists wrote me. My former professors wrote me and said, you know what, Mark, I was proud of you for saying those things because they were true, right? I know they were true. I never heard them say it in public, but I still do think if you have to encourage each other, right? Things are so much easier to do when you know you have friends. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for all of you that you were coming, and also for all of you watching us online. I hope you are staying. We are allowed to stay here until 10 o'clock to talk and network. If you have time, drink some coffee maybe before going to sleep. So, yeah, thank you very much, and enjoy the evening.